I think that I got through all of the information that we needed to get through. And at this point, we should be ready for Dr. Varia. And I just realized that in the midst of all the crazy, I think I closed your bio. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to just have you tell us a little bit about yourself at this point. What I can tell you from memory is that Rachna Varia is a co-founder of Mindwell Psychology. Yep, and I don't remember the rest of it from the top of my head, but what I will say is that many years ago, I attended a workshop at a school where she was presenting the same topic that she's presenting tonight. And I thought to myself, this is a person who I would want to be evaluating my own kids, because she explained assessments in the same way that I learned about it in a Learning Disabilities graduate program. And I said, you know, she makes it easy for parents to understand, and I just think gets it right. So I'm delighted to welcome her to our meeting tonight. And I think I will just turn it over to you at this point.
Okay, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me. So yes, my name is Rachna Varia. I'm a co-founder of Mindwell Psychology, and I've been a licensed clinical psychologist for almost 25 years. For the past, almost 17, 18 years, I've really been focusing on neuropsychological or psychoeducational testing. And I have a specific interest in dyslexia. Dyslexia and ADHD, but I tend to, if I can work with kids really young and I can find out if they have the dyslexia at age 6 or 7, that's just so good because dyslexia can be remediated. And so I want to make sure that they're getting the intervention that they need. So tonight I'm going to talk about psychoeducational testing in general. I'm going to use those two terms, psychoeducational and neuropsychological, interchangeably. For my purposes, they're the same term. So I'm going to share my screen. One second. Okay, so understanding psychoeducational testing. Oops, it is not moving. Hold on one second. There we go. Okay, so the point of getting psychoeducational testing is to really determine a diagnosis, importance of testing at an early stage to determine areas of strengths and areas of weakness, but it's never too late. At Mindwell, we've tested people who are in their 50s, who are in their 60s, who are struggling with work. We test students who are in graduate school. We test students who are in college. But it's wonderful when we can actually test kids in grade school because we can get them on the right path. So what is neuropsychological testing? A systematic study of major areas of cognitive and academic functioning, translation, or knowing how you learn. It establishes a profile of personal strengths and weaknesses, or information about maximizing strengths and accommodating or remediating weaknesses. And it allows us to make inferences about a person's brain function, or determining if you have a learning disability, which is something you'd want to know. Okay, so facts about learning disabilities. 15% of the US population, or 1 in 7 Americans, has some type of learning disability. And as many as 80% of students with learning disabilities have reading problems. So that's why you'll see a lot of psychoeducational testing tends to focus on reading, and we'll talk about that further in the talk. Attention disorders such as ADHD and learning disabilities often occur at the same time, but the two disorders are not the same. And between 30 and 50% of children with learning disabilities will also have ADHD. The reverse is also true. Between 30 and 50% of children with ADHD will also have a learning disability. So it's wise to look for both possibilities. Pressing return and it's not going to the next page. Hold on a second. Okay, there we go. So first area, there are a lot of different areas that we're going to assess. Tonight we're going to talk about cognitive ability, memory, executive functioning, the auditory route to reading, the visual route to reading. We're going to talk about reading, writing, and math, and how we have to map out all of those different areas to figure out how a child learns. Okay, so the first area of cognitive ability is something called verbal comprehension. We also assess for nonverbal reasoning and visual spatial skills. Now, what does verbal comprehension mean? Basically, we're testing the child's vocabulary. And this isn't if they just know the word in context. We're looking to see if they can be precise and if they can be elaborate, if they can elaborate on the definition. We also test abstraction. So it starts pretty easy. We might ask, how are red and blue alike? But it gets more and more abstract, and we're really testing to see if the child can use language at a critical thinking level. We also test for nonverbal reasoning, which is using deductive and quantitative logic. So we give the student patterns to figure out, we give them ratios to figure out. There's no language involved in these tasks, so we're really testing their nonverbal reasoning. And then visual spatial skills is the third sort of heavy hitter of cognitive ability, also known as IQ. But IQ isn't just one thing. IQ includes verbal comprehension, nonverbal reasoning, visual spatial skills. It also actually includes working memory and processing speed. But with visual spatial skills, we're testing their whole part relationships. We give them puzzles to figure out. They have to manipulate figures in their mind, to have to rotate figures. So these three areas give us an idea of the problem-solving skills of the student, how they think about things, how they approach tasks. So that's sort of the foundation of psychoeducational testing. We also test executive functioning. Now, there are two areas of executive functioning: cognitive regulation and behavioral regulation. So let's talk about cognitive regulation first. We're going to test for attention. That comes up a lot. Parents will report that the child can focus on something they're interested in, but if it's low interest, if it's tedious, if it's challenging, sometimes focus might really be a challenge. We're also looking at the child's ability to initiate, to get started on a task, to shift, to be able to move fluidly from one task to another. Also looking at organization and planning. We look at working memory, which is, can you hold information in your mind for 3 to 5 seconds, which is basically another word for attention. And we look at task monitoring, being able to monitor one's own performance, being aware of time management. So we assess this in 3 main ways. Something called a continuous performance task. It's a test that we do on the computer. It's a boring test, but we want to see if the child can pay attention even when they're bored. And it measures reaction time, it measures impulsivity, it measures attention, it measures their ability to be vigilant during a task. We also give questionnaires to the parents, to the teachers. If the child is old enough, we also ask them to fill out questionnaires, sort of measuring their own working memory, initiation, shifting. And there are also structured tasks of executive functioning that we can give. One of the most popular ones is called the Dellis-Kaplan, where we're testing ability for fluency, to shift between tasks, and to do 2 things at once. Now, the other part of executive functioning is behavioral regulation. So there's self-monitoring, noticing how your behavior affects others. This also includes hyperactivity, feeling restless, on the go, feeling like you have a motor. Also inhibition, being able to pause or react or stop before an action. Mostly, this is assessed through questionnaires, so through parent and teacher report. Okay, so why is attention so important in learning? Because attention is the first part of the learning process. First, you attend to something that you see or something that you hear, and then you encode it. You make it meaningful in your mind, you store it, and then there's recall. Recall whether it's for a test, homework, or a dinner discussion. But if the attention phase is short-circuited, the student is not paying attention in the first place, the entire learning process can be short-circuited. So that's why we really want to focus on, is attention at its optimal level? So ADHD. For kids, when there's a low interest task, or it might be tedious, or it might be challenging, their energy level decreases. So we try to conceptualize ADHD almost more as a disorder of arousal than attention. So when people without ADHD have to do something they don't want to do, they sort of gear up and get it done. For someone with ADHD, the energy level drops, and then they might avoid, they might procrastinate, forget, they might get distracted, and the task isn't completed. And this can often result in feeling anxious. So a common vicious cycle I see is students getting distracted by non-essential details or overthinking. That contributes to a lack of focus. Then their efficiency decreases for whatever task they're trying to do. They get more distracted and they feel more anxious. Once they feel more anxious, that makes them get more distracted. So then we're in a vicious loop. Okay, so executive functioning. Remember, ADHD is not just an attention disorder. It's a highly genetic medical disorder affecting an array of abilities related to executive functioning, including self-regulation, organization, planning, and forethought. And it's often referred to as our brain manager. ADHD can affect attention, behavior, projects, time management, sustaining routines, goals, emotions, and more. So any psychoeducational or neuropsychological evaluation should include executive functioning. Excuse me. Okay, another very important area to assess is memory. And there are 3 types of memory. Working memory, as I mentioned before, is 3 to 5 seconds. So how I might assess for this is I might say some numbers and ask the student to say it backwards. Then I might say some more numbers and ask the student to say them in forward order or in numerical order. So I'm seeing if they can attend to what I'm saying in that moment. Now with short-term memory, we're assessing verbal and visual memory. So I might tell them a story, see how much they remember. I might give them a list of words to remember. I might show them photographs. I might show them a design they have to remember. So it's nice to know both auditory memory and visual memory. And we can find out if kids are more visual learners or verbal learners. And then we test for long-term memory, which is actually only about 30 minutes post presenting the information. But we're really seeing if the student has encoded the material that they saw or that they heard, if they've stored it, and if they can recall it spontaneously. So another important area of neuropsychological testing. Okay, so this is where I think it gets really interesting and really important. Reading obviously is a cornerstone of any type of learning. And there's an auditory route to reading, which includes 3 different areas: phonological awareness, rapid naming, and auditory working memory. So let's start with phonological awareness. An individual's awareness of and access to the sound structure of his or her oral language. So what you might see in the classroom with someone who has phonological issues is word finding issues or word retrieval issues. They may substitute words. I just had a student that I tested recently who called they called a calculator a carburetor. Problems with rhyming, not recognizing beginning and ending sounds. And so this impacts decoding, reading, decoding, being able to pronounce a word, decipher a word, and it often impacts spelling. So a very common test that we give for this is called the Comprehensive Test of Phonological Processing, 2nd edition. It's called the CTOP. And we ask the child to blend words, blend sounds, segment sounds, identify beginning sounds, ending sounds. So for example, It starts very easy. Say popcorn, but don't say pop. Can they recognize that corn is left? But then it gets pretty tough. We might say winter, but don't say t. Well, they know that winner is left. A lot of dyslexic students think that it's just win that is left because they can't take the ending sound to the beginning sound and match them together. So phonological awareness is an essential area of psychoeducational testing, as is rapid naming, the speed at which you can retrieve labels to symbols, colors, letters, and numbers. So we're just asking the child to name letters as fast as they can, name numbers as fast as they can. And the reason why this is important is because we want to see if it's automatic. The goal isn't to be fast for fast's sake, but can it be automatic so that you have room for comprehension? Oftentimes when we see issues with rapid naming, we have students have difficulty with naming colors, days of the week, months of the year at a younger age. The alphabet is not automatic, difficulty with skip counting. But when rapid naming is slow, it often impacts reading fluency. So again, because the reading isn't automatic, there's not enough energy left over for comprehension. Third area we assess is called auditory working memory. This is ordering and sequencing heard information into meaningful chunks. What you might see in the classroom, students might lack a sense of time. There might be note-taking challenges. So the teacher's giving a lecture, but the student is having trouble keeping up with what is being said. There might also be challenges with following multi-step directions. When we see weaknesses in auditory working memory, it often impacts spelling, ordering of letters and words, and general decoding. But there is also a visual route to reading, which often goes, people don't recognize this as much, and I think this is very important to assess. Orthographic awareness, visual discrimination, and visual motor skills. So let's start with visual motor processing. The ability to coordinate what one sees to a motor response to reproduce something that he or she sees using a pencil and paper. So we give the student a copying task. They have to copy figures that have angles, overlaps, three-dimensionality, and we're really looking if they can understand the whole and the part and coordinate what they see to a motor response. So what you might often see in the classroom with someone who has a visual motor issue is sluggish handwriting or handwriting that's not on one plane. Difficulty copying from board or books. So information's presented on the blackboard or the whiteboard, and it's either taking them a longer amount of time to copy it down or they're copying it down incorrectly. And then also just dumbing down written work, that they can express themselves verbally quite well, but the actual act of writing is so laborious that what they might be able to say verbally becomes very simplistic when they try to write it. So an impact on written organization and spelling. Visual discrimination, using the sense of sight to notice and compare the features of different items to distinguish one item from another. So what you might see in the classroom, misunderstanding or confusing written symbols. So again, I just tested someone recently who subtracted everything that he was supposed to add. He was messing up the plus and the minus sign. BD reversals, PQ reversals, 6-9 reversals, 2-5 reversals. So this is going to impact, just sort of very pragmatically, being able to decipher a worksheet. I am a big fan of measuring orthographic awareness. Make sure that if you get testing done, the evaluator assesses for orthographic awareness. This is the ability to decode words by how the letters, the ability to decode words by how the letters sound is the phonological process, and the ability to decode them by how the letters in the words are placed is the orthographic process. So you're looking at letter sequences and you're looking at spatial position patterns in words. Now, to be clear, this is not a vision issue. We're not testing vision. We're not testing their eyesight. We're seeing if their brain can process common digraphs like TH, common vowel digraphs, common sequences, bridge vowels. And so by noticing where the letters are in the word, they can decode the word. A test that I usually give to measure orthographic awareness is called the test of orthographic competence, the TOC, the talk. Okay, so we talked about memory, we talked about executive functioning, we talked about cognitive ability, we talked about the visual route to reading, the auditory route to reading. So now let's actually get to reading. In a neuropsychological examination, we are going to be measuring phonemic decoding, timed and untimed. Now, phonemic decoding is basically we're asking the student to read nonsense words, and we're giving them nonsense words because we want to make sure they haven't memorized the word. Now, the reason I always give timed and untimed is there are a lot of students who can actually laboriously figure out a word, and they get credit for it, but it's not automatic. So we want to see, can they decode a nonsense word automatically? We're going to also look at the orthographic decoding. We're going to look at their reading comprehension, and this should usually be done with both silent reading comprehension and oral reading comprehension. The oral reading is so important because this is where I get to see the students' errors. If they're making errors in accuracy, if they're inserting words, if they're deleting words, if they're making up new words based on the first couple letters of the word, I want to see the quality of their reading. And then we're also measuring reading fluency. Again, the goal isn't to be fast for fast's sake, but to be automatic. So here we often give silent, simple sentences, and they have to answer if they're true or false. We might also measure their oral reading. Two major tests that we give for reading is the Woodcock-Johnson 4th edition and the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test. It's actually now on its 4th edition as well. The Gray Oral Reading Test is a great measure to look at accuracy, fluency, and comprehension. Okay, so then we also want to look at writing. We're going to look at spelling, both recognition and production. So I find it really interesting to see if the child can recognize acknowledged spelling. So on the talk that I mentioned before, the test of orthographic competence, it gives different homonyms, and the student has to identify based on the picture the correct spelling of the word. So can they recognize what good spelling looks like? Then we also ask them to obviously spell real words. We ask them to write sentences, both combining and building sentences. So a lot of times children with dysgraphia, which is a disorder of written expression, have problems combining two sentences into one more precise sentence. Then we're also looking at them building a sentence based on a target word. And then for 9 and up, ages 9 and up, we're looking for them to compose a paragraph. So we ask them to write a story. And here we're measuring contextual conventions, we're measuring their story construction skills, things like capitalization, punctuation. Are they using introductory clauses? Are they using conversation? Is there a sequence to their story? And these are all based on age or grade-based norms. Math, we're going to measure calculation, both timed and untimed, but without a calculator. I get asked that a lot. Can I use my calculator? No. We want to see if you can know those basic operations of manipulating fractions, long division, percentages, exponents, multiplication, regrouping. But we also look at math fluency, just math facts, addition, subtraction, and multiplication. We'll time them on these tasks. And then a pride problem. So we're giving them word problems. Usually the problems are read to them because we don't want the reading to be an interference issue. So we'll read them the problem, they're looking at it, but we want to see if they can use math reasoning to determine the right operation to use to solve the problem. Okay, so when an assessor works with a student, it's usually for several hours with breaks. There's lots of different tasks, and each task is only about 5 or 10 minutes. So there's so much variety. And it's not the student just sitting there filling out a Scantron sheet. It's a conversation between the examiner and the student, because how they approach the task is sometimes just as important as the answer. So I want to know if something was boring, if something was interesting, if something was challenging. I'm also making observations. So while I'm giving them a list of numbers to remember, I want to see, are they having difficulty because of attention? Are they having difficulty because of anxiety? Are they having difficulty because of auditory processing? Are they having difficulty because they're uncomfortable with numbers? So the examiner-examinee relationship is so important. And this is just why I feel really strongly that it should always, the testing should always be done by a psychologist and not a student. I think the actual interaction of watching, observing, experiencing the assessment is so important. So we get a constellation of scores, everything that I just talked about: memory, executive functioning, processing. Scores are based on what we call standard scores, where a score of 100 is average. Scores between 90 and 109 are in the average range. Now we're comparing the student either to other students exactly their age. So it might be someone 11 years, 8 months. Those are different norms than for someone who's 11 years, 4 months, because we're expecting more or less based on the age. We might also be comparing them to the grade level. So we're getting information based on a national sample. If their scores are in the average range, below average, very low, extremely low, or on the other end, if they're above average, very high, extremely high. No student has all average scores. No student has all extremely high scores. It's the constellation of scores that's so important to understand. Why is one score high? Why is one score low? What's causing that relative weakness? And what can we do about it? So like I mentioned before, this is based on a bell curve where 100 is average. Scores between the 25th and 75th percentile are average. And I know 25 sounds low. We're not talking about 25%. We're talking about 25th percentile in terms of also comparing them to other kids their age. So scores between 25 and 75th percentile are average. Scores below 25 are below average, and scores above 75 are above average. So let me just show you a case example. This, remember, 100 is average. Let's say I do a verbal IQ test and I find out their verbal IQ is 115. So above average verbal comprehension. They can use language very well. They're able to express themselves. I find out that their visual memory is at a 121, which is actually in the very high range. So when I show them information, they're able to encode it, store it, and recall. So far, everything that we're assessing is looking really strong. Another area that I might assess is their sight word recognition. So these are real words. I'm looking to see, can they sort of quickly and automatically name, decode, say real words. And they can. They have a standard score of 103, so still in the average range. But now we're getting a low score. Phonemic decoding, standard score 83. So this is in the below average range. Now remember, phonemic decoding is we're having the student decode nonsense words? Because again, we want to make sure they haven't memorized the word. Do they know the rules of the English language to know when a G makes the hard G sound, when the G makes the soft G sound, when a C makes the K sound versus the S sound? There are actually rules for almost every word in the English language, as quirky as English is. Do they know these rules? Now, 4 out of 5 students tend to pick up on these rules automatically. 1 out of 5 need to be taught these rules explicitly. So the research is showing that 1 out of 5 students might have some form or some level of dyslexia. Now that might vary from mild, moderate to severe, but the intervention's the same. They need to be taught the rules, the phonics, usually in a multi-sensory manner, where they have to hear it, they have to see it, they might have to feel it, they might need to know where their tongue is in their mouth when they say the word, but they need to know the rules of the English language. So far with this student, we have someone who has a strong verbal IQ, strong visual memory. They can read real words, but given an unfamiliar word, they're not sure what to do with it. Another area that might be assessed is their phonological awareness. And again, this is sort of the auditory route to reading. Are they understanding the blends of words, how to segment a word, the beginning, middle, and ending sounds? Now, interestingly, their phonological awareness and the phonemic decoding was both below average, which is a common pattern that we see. Phonological awareness often predicts phonemic decoding. And a very low score, phonemic decoding efficiency, standard score 68. So with phonemic decoding at standard score 83, I was measuring could they decode nonsense words in an untimed situation. Then I'm asking them to decode nonsense words in a time situation. And for someone who's dyslexic, this is very, very challenging. And how this translates into the real world is that when they're given a word that they don't know, an unfamiliar word, they don't know what to do with it. I find out their reading comprehension's at a 90, so that's actually in the average range. They're probably using their strong verbal IQ to compensate, but oftentimes there's only so long you can compensate. When kids get to the high school level and they're asked to read very complicated text, we want to make sure they're able to decipher every word in that text. And then I asked them to write single sentences. That's at a 109, so in the average range. And their spelling, though, was very low at a standard score of 79. So this student has both dyslexia, issues with decoding words, and dysgraphia, issues with spelling words as well. And then contextual conventions. I asked them to write a story. Their ability to use conversation, introductory clauses is below average. So I'm using this as an example to show you that it's a constellation of scores. There's no one ADHD test. There's no dyslexia test. There are usually about 30 different subtests that we administer from about 7 to 15 different tests. So to review, neuropsychological testing can help with identifying learning disabilities because we're finding out what the weakness is, what the processing issue is that's causing the educational impact in reading, writing, or math. Is it a memory issue? Is it a processing issue? Is it a cognitive issue? Is it an executive functioning issue? Again, we're trying to figure out how you learn. So for any student, this is just such helpful information because like I said, no one has all average scores or above average scores. We want to find out the child's unique constellation of scores. Are they more of a verbal learner? Are they more of an auditory learner? Are they a visual learner? Do they need context? Do they do better with repetition? We want to find out how the child learns. And then it provides recommendations for maximizing strengths and remediating weaknesses. So any good neuropsychological assessment will provide recommendations for both what should happen at school, what should happen at home, and basically 3 different areas: remediation, accommodation, and modification. So an accommodation might be something like extended time, or a modification might be that the child is allowed to type instead of handwrite. Remediation is an actual program, like an Orton-Gillingham program, to remediate dyslexia. So that's a specific program that's multi-sensory, empirically validated program to treat reading issues. So again, to provide recommendations for accommodation and remediation. All right, folks, so that's what I have. If you see any red flags, don't wait. Early intervention is the key to remediation, and that's really the key. But again, it's never too late. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I always get something new out of your presentations. So, once again, fantastic. Thank you. We do have some questions that have come in. So I'm just going to start to throw them at you, if that's all right.
Sure.
First one, what if any of these assessments are normed or accessible for students with complex communication needs?
That's a very good question. Almost everything I talked about is not normed for kids with complex communication needs. We'd have to give a test of nonverbal intelligence. So the most used one is called the C-TONI, the Comprehensive Test of Nonverbal Intelligence. So when someone is challenged with language, then we want to really look at their nonverbal reasoning.
And is that test more of an intelligence rather than an achievement?
It is. It's looking at cognitive ability. Now, with the writing, it depends on what the communication disorder is, but the oral reading would probably be difficult. So then we'd be looking at comprehension more with silent comprehension. A common test for that is the Gray silent reading test. But again, it depends on that specific child and exactly what disability they
have. Sorry, I want to make sure that I have everything here.
Michelle, quick ask, Can you put the gallery mode back on?
I can try. Did I just do it now?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Okay, good. Technology. All right, let me just copy over one more question here to keep on my list so I don't lose it. Okay, if private testing was done, and again, some of these questions may not relate directly to your work as a private evaluator. So some of them we may need to sort of feel out together. If private testing was done, for example, confirming ADHD or another LD diagnosis outside, in the assessment was done outside the school setting, does the school also conduct its own assessment in school? I believe the answer to that is yes, that they will.
It's usually yes. It depends on the school. So some schools will say, we're going to take the testing from the evaluator and do behavioral observations to sort of confirm the results. Other schools will say, no, we need to replicate the results that the tester did, but they're not going to do the full evaluation. They might do some targeted subtests. And then sort of the third tier level is they'll say, yes, we need to do the full testing. My experience has been if a child already has an IEP, then they usually will use my testing without having to do additional testing. But if it's their first time getting an IEP, then they usually also want to conduct the school testing.
Something that I've also come across is families who are doing private testing at the same time that the school is doing their assessment. And something I always encourage parents to do is make sure that those assessors are communicating with each other. Because
100%, because a test can't be repeated. We can't both do the same test within the same year. So it's very important that we know what testing the school is doing and vice versa, so nothing is getting repeated, which would then invalidate the results.
Absolutely. Let's see. What kind of language do you recommend parents use with their kids to describe what's going to be happening at an assessment? I typically use language like, you're going to be going to do some activities. I don't use the word testing because kids get anxious about testing. What language do you recommend parents use to describe what's going to happen?
I often tell parents to tell them it's like working with a teacher. It's going to remind them of school, that they're going to be doing puzzles, patterns, some memory things, some word games, some things on the computer. And it's really to find out how their brain learns, how they think about things. And I always say the point is not to get everything right. If they got everything right, that'd be sort of weird. So that's not the point. The point is to figure out how they approach a task, and just to find out sort of what comes easier for them, what comes harder. And if we find out what comes harder, we'll know how to make that easier for them.
And I love using that language of what's easy for you and what's hard for you, because we all have things that are easy for us and hard for us, and that puts the whole strengths and weaknesses into a very kid-friendly framework. Another question that came in, we've been approved for an IEE, an independent educational evaluation, which, just for everybody to know, is your right as a parent, one of your special education rights. If you disagree with the assessment that's been done in school, you can make a request to the Office of Due Process that you would like an IEE, which is an independent educational evaluation, done at school system expense, where you take your child to an outside provider to have another evaluation done. So the question is, we've been approved for an IEE. I suspect dyslexia, and I already have confirmed ADHD. Do you have recommendations on doing the IEE now or waiting until we can get back to school?
Oh, get the IEE done now. The sooner you get information, the better. I know it's so challenging with the virtual learning, but you want to know if it is dyslexia, what processing issue is causing the dyslexia. And then, you want to see what the school can obviously do in terms of accommodations, modifications, but then also what you might be able to do at home for the remediation. So the sooner, the better.
I would completely agree with you on that. Let's see.
Michelle?
Yes.
I actually have a question that has come in from our Facebook page.
Okay.
Regarding what is the difference between a psychoeducational testing and neuropsyc testing?
That's how I started the talk. So I use those terms interchangeably. Neuropsychological testing is measuring different type of brain functioning, memory, executive functioning. Psychoeducational testing tends to emphasize a little bit more of the educational impact. So in my training, when I was trained with neuropsychology, it was mostly working with adults who might have brain disorders like dementia or traumatic brain injury. Now I tend to use the term psychoeducational because I'm still measuring memory, executive functioning, cognitive ability, but I want to see the impact on reading, writing, and math. And sometimes neuropsych testing does not always, but doesn't always look at the educational impact.
Thank you. That is something that I'm asked frequently as well. Let's see. While we're on the topic of IEEs, do you do evaluations for IEEs?
Yep, all the time. So actually for Fairfax County, Loudoun, Prince William, Alexandria City, Fauquier, for all the counties in the area. And I like doing them because I like giving parents a second opinion. It's a second opinion on what's going on with their child. And the testing, when it's done privately, just tends to look at the subtleties a little bit more. And also, like I said, it's not a student doing the evaluation, it's myself. And I just feel like my behavioral observations are just so important.
And another insider tip for our parents, when you do request from Due Process a IEE, they will give you a list of providers who have already been approved. It is not a complete list of providers. And you, if you so desire, can call other providers, such as Dr. Varia, who are not on the list, and ask if they are under contract with the school system to do an IEE. If they're not, you can actually get the information of what it entails to them, and they can decide if that's something they want to do or not. But know that that list they give you is not the final
It's not
list.
No, that's right. You can go to any licensed clinical psychologist.
Yep.
That's your prerogative.
And speaking of IEEs, if you request an IEE, question that came in, are you required to provide the results to the school district before providing them to the parents?
Fairfax County is very strict about that. So what we've been doing is we mail the report, the final report, to the eligibility team, or to the Office of Special Education, but I will give an oral debriefing in person. So now this is before COVID, but the parents would come in, I'd have the report in hand, I'll go through the report step by step. Usually the debriefing is about 90 minutes, but I can't give them a copy of the report until the school sends them the report. But I will make sure that they know all the results of the testing through an oral feedback.
And that sounds like that's the rule from FCPS.
It's FCPS. It's not for other counties. So it is specific to FCPS.
Okay, and I don't think that there's federal guidelines on that. I don't think that's violating any kind of federal rules.
Yeah, it's been frustrating.
Yes, for sure. I can imagine, especially when parents are sitting there trying to absorb all this information. Let's see, we have several other questions. How do you track in school a child's phonemic awareness and writing development? So the kid's been diagnosed with dyslexia, for example. How do you track the progress that they're making with their remediation?
So I probably can't speak too much to this because this would be the teacher or the academic therapist who's actually assessing that information, but they would be looking at accuracy errors. They'd be looking at percentage of words correct and incorrect. They'd be looking at to see if comprehension was going up. But when I'm doing the assessment, I'm doing sort of a snapshot in time. I'm not sort of reviewing their improvement.
Sorry, bear with me for just a moment here. I'm trying to keep things in a logical order for us. So if you have a child who is recommended for getting remediation for their dyslexia, for example, how frequently and what length of time would you say sessions should be held?
So the research currently shows if it's a significant dyslexia, intervention should be 4 to 5 times a week, 60 to 90 minutes at a time. And I know that sounds like a lot, but basically we're retraining the brain to figure out another way to decode those words. It completely depends on the child, how many years that might take. It might take 6 months, it might take 3 years. It also depends on the age of the child. It depends on how severe the dyslexia is. It also depends on if there are other comorbid issues like ADHD. But 4 to 5 times a week, 60 to 90 minutes.
I actually want to go back to the IEE question for a moment. If there are no state or federal regulations saying that the school system has to see the results before the evaluator, then what is the consequence of you giving parents a copy of those results?
They won't pay me.
That's a big consequence.
Yeah, I mean, I've gotten calls from, because what I used to just give it to the parents, and I've gotten scolding calls just saying you're not allowed to do that. We've tried to figure out sort of where does it say that you're not allowed to do that. We haven't figured that out, but we get calls from the director of special education just saying we won't accept any more evaluations from Mindwell if you continue to do that.
I am not an attorney, nor do I pretend to be one, but that sounds awfully fishy to me.
I know.
All right, back to our questions here. Could you explain a little bit, at least using this language, the discrepancy model, the discrepancy between potential and achievement, between ability and what students produce?
Yeah, so usually when they talk about the discrepancy model, they're talking about cognitive ability. So that's IQ. Remember, that's not just one single term, but looking at problem solving skills, verbal skills, reasoning skills, the discrepancy between that and academic achievement. So what the student is producing in terms of their reading comprehension, their reading decoding. Generally, the discrepancy model is based on one standard deviation. So I was telling you about the bell curve. 100 is average. So let's say we find out that a child's IQ is 100, but their reading is at an 85, 15 points below what might be predicted based on their ability. As a psychologist, I definitely take in the discrepancy, but I don't only rely on the discrepancy model. I think that qualitatively, it's really important to find out what type of errors they're making. It might be, less than 15 points, and they might still have a learning disability.
So we have somebody who commented that your child was denied an IEP, actually based on testing done at Mindwell, not because of the quality of the testing, but because they were told there were no peaks and valleys.
And this is tough. This is really tough because when I'm assessing, I'm trying to find out at a pure level, are they struggling with learning? But the school does have certain guidelines. And so if you're not failing 2 years behind, if your valley isn't low enough, then you're not going to get services. Does that mean your child doesn't have a learning disability? No. But does that mean that school doesn't have to provide services? Yes. So that's where it's very challenging.
Absolutely. And I also remember learning that it would drive me crazy is that those discrepancies vary from state to state. So some states or school systems might use 2 standard deviations, some might use 1.5. So you can qualify for a learning disability in one state and not another, or one school system and not another, which is a whole other story together. All right, let's see, another question. If testing was done with a speech pathologist recently, would you review that testing? Would you review before further testing? I think this is asking about the repetition of assessments and tests.
Yeah, because there's some overlap between what psychologists and SLPs do. So the speech language pathologist might give the CTOP, for example, the comprehensive test of phonological processing. Now, they're not going to give any IQ testing. They're probably not going to give any executive functioning testing. They're going to give language testing. So we would definitely want to review that.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of overlap between speech and language disorders and learning disabilities. That language piece is a big overlap, and a good speech evaluation can probably be an asset to you when you're looking.
Absolutely.
As well. Somebody asked, if I called your office and requested to work with you as opposed to one of your colleagues, would that be considered?
Yeah.
I tried before COVID. I was told you were not available for our meeting.
No, I mean, it's a matter of timing. Unfortunately, you might have to wait a little longer. I'm not a big fan of parents having to wait. So I'd rather you work with one of my colleagues who might be able to get you in sooner. But if there's a strong preference, then yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Is it important for you, as doing the evaluation, to observe the child in the classroom setting? Obviously pre-COVID, because now is just completely different.
Yeah. I generally will observe preschool students. Once they're in grade school, obviously not in middle school, high school. I don't do classroom observations. I will sometimes, call the teacher, have the teacher fill out questionnaires, do an interview with the teacher. And that is a negative of private testing, that you're not getting the classroom behavioral observation, which I think is very important.
I want to go back because we got a little clarification here about, I think this is the person who asked about the testing that didn't have peaks and valleys. Hopefully I'm not mixing up our different questions. But they mentioned that the testing did show that they were 2 years behind. So they're wondering about recommendations on where to go from here.
Private intervention. So if this was an issue for reading disorder, working with a tutor or academic therapist who's certified to remediate the reading issue. If it's an ADHD, possibly working with an executive functioning coach. The family has to consider medication. That's a very personal decision. That's a family decision, or possibly cognitive behavioral therapy. So just very pragmatically, if the school's not going to do anything, then you have to pursue private means.
And sometimes some of those services are covered by insurance and some of them are not. And I would advise people to certainly check with your health insurance provider to see what's covered for you. The issue about the 2 year behind, we have a comment here that it's the 2 years behind is a fallacy. If a student's in the 25th percentile 1 year and then 3 years later they're still in the 25th percentile, did they make progress?
So sorry, the question is if they're still at the 25th percentile?
Yes.
I mean, the 25th percentile is still considered the average range. So that's considered average.
And so a child who's in the 25th percentile and then let's say 3 years later is still the 25th percentile. If I'm remembering and understanding correctly, they did make progress because they maintained their curve, so to speak, but they didn't close the gap.
That's exactly right. So
okay.
At 7, at the 25th percentile, they were performing at the 25th percentile compared to other 7-year-olds. Now at 10 years old, 3 years later, they're not still performing at the 7-year-old level, but they're performing at the 10-year-old level at the 25th percentile.
Excellent. Thank you for that clarification. I do see your trauma question, Jenna. I'm going to come back to it. I'm not skipping you. Our SEPTA population does consist of a lot of parents of kids who are twice exceptional. Would you talk a little bit about how your evaluations would include looking for twice exceptionality?
Sure. So again, I look at the constellation of scores. And so oftentimes kids who have dyslexia have really remarkable visual spatial scores, can have very strong language abilities. There's sometimes a discrepancy between verbal and written expression. So the written expression is weak, but the vocabulary, the language skills are so strong. So by looking at all the different points of the constellation, I can determine if something's in the very high range and compare that to something that might be below average.
And a question related to trauma. Can you speak to a child whose testing results might be skewed because the child has experienced trauma, and so their trauma response is masking their actual abilities?
That's a tough one. We want to take emotional factors into play. So we would be in our family history, when I'd be talking to the parents, I'd find out that history of trauma. Can I make a direct correlation between the trauma and the learning? No, but I would definitely speak to it.
Also, you had mentioned that the relationship between the examiner and the examinee is really important. And so, for example, if a child gets triggered by something during a test, hopefully the examiner would be aware and noticing behavioral changes in the child. That
Absolutely. I mean, I've had kids who freeze, who get so anxious, who get mute. So I really want to be in the room with them when that's happening.
Why do some schools do assessments based on grade level and then other assessments are based on age? When do you look at grade norms versus age norms?
It's a good question. I think it sometimes depends on the evaluator. So almost every test that I give, I can make a choice about whether I want to compare it to grade or I want to compare it to age. Now, in general, I like to compare it to age. I just feel like we're expecting certain things from an 11-year, 6-month-old. There may be times where I have to compare it to grade, maybe if they've repeated a grade. Sometimes I'll give both. I'll give grade and age-based norms, but I think it depends on the evaluator.
Absolutely so. Sorry. I would have to agree. Let's see, another question. What are your thoughts in general on IQ testing? For example, everyone might say, my child's IQ must be much higher than he tests, but yeah, my kid keeps getting the same score.
I'm not a fan of IQ. It's so overrated. I'm a bigger fan of grit. That's another talk that I give. You know, can we get these kids to have a growth mindset and really sort of praise the effort? I never want a parent, much less a child, to get focused on a number of an IQ. IQ is not a singular thing. There's also emotional intelligence. Mm-hmm. You can have someone with, let's say, a very strong verbal IQ, 130, but their nonverbal reasoning IQ might be 94. So what does that mean? What is their IQ? So it's more important to analyze the different points than to focus on any specific number.
And let's see, actually related to that, do you find trends in kids' IQ testing over time? Like, do they tend to remain the same or do they regress towards the mean? Do they?
Towards the mean. If the child is tested at a very early age, like at 4, 5, 6, then usually their IQ score will regress to the mean, which means they'll get lower, because at age 4, 5, and 6, we're looking at more crystallized knowledge. What color is grass? How many legs does a cow have? And then at age 7, 8, 9, we're looking at more abstract skills that they might not have learned. And so I see regression to the mean when a child is tested very young to a couple of years later. But in general, IQ should be consistent. It should be reliable over time. So usually when IQ scores are given, there's a band that it's given in. Let's say the IQ is 94. It'll say a 95 confidence interval. If we were to give this IQ test again, the score would be between 90 and 99. So you'll get sort of a band of mm-hmm. where it would fall.
Yeah, that confidence interval there, right?
That's right.
Throwing out the lingo there. You might hear it in your reports. Do you know of any practitioners who specialize in testing kids with complex communication needs where there's a really huge discrepancy between what they know and what they're able to express? This sort of ties into the question earlier.
Yeah, That's when I would probably go to Children's Hospital, Kennedy Krieger, or the Keller Center. Because then we're looking sort of almost more at a medical diagnosis, and that if the discrepancy is so severe, then someone who's an expert in that area and maybe also a multi-team approach would be important.
Probably working with, for example, like neuropsych and an occupational therapist and a speech therapist, and kind of getting lots of eyes on the kiddo. A couple more questions for you. Let's see. Students with reading disabilities may need to handwrite letters and words in terms of building neural pathways in their brains. How do you reconcile that with using keyboarding as an accommodation?
Depends on if the child has a visual motor issue.
Yeah.
If they have a visual motor issue where the actual motor visual perception to motor response is short-circuited, it's not going to help them to handwrite. I'm a big fan of handwriting and taking notes by hand, but it depends on that child's specific profile.
Absolutely. So I think, speaking from experience, it also depends on if the child can read back their writing.
Right.
As they get older, if they can't read back their writing, you don't want them taking notes with handwriting.
That's right. And whether it's keyboarding or also, dictating. So I'm not saying dictating is right for everyone, because again, that act of writing is a very powerful tool. I completely agree with that, but not for every student.
Yep. Speaking then of kids as they get older, when they're maybe in middle school or early high school, what assessments or indicators would you use to help families make decisions as to whether or not college is the right fit for their student?
Yeah, I mean, the thing with college, it's about workload and time management. So I actually have a freshman in college right now. And when I ask her, what's the difference between high school and college, she'll just say, they're asking me to read a whole book in 3 days. They've assigned 300 pages of reading. So it's really about load and volume and executive functioning. Executive functioning is key, planning, time management. So those are the discussions you'd want to have with that student and figure out, what ways they can sort of up that game, the executive functioning.
I will share a personal anecdote on this, is that I have a child who had a lot of executive functioning trouble. Grades were so much lower in high school because he was constantly missing turning in assignments. I was very apprehensive about him going off to college where he's studying computer science. And lo and behold, he's doing really well with all this executive functioning stuff. And so I said to him, what's the difference? And he said, I'm interested in my classes.
Yes.
And I'm really motivated to get the work done because I'm interested in it. And that relates back to the whole attention piece too.
They're more invested.
Yeah, so it's not that the executive functioning skills suddenly magically improved, but the intrinsic motivation improved, which makes a huge difference for some kids. Let's see. Can you offer any suggestions, given that we are in a virtual setting? So I'm trying to translate this question. Bear with me for a moment here. Seeing teachers. I'm not sure that I'm fully understanding the question. I apologize. I think that it is about the difference between face-to-face versus virtual, and how much being able to see one another and connect with one another makes a difference. I'm sorry if I'm not.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes a huge difference. I mean, some kids are better adept at the virtual learning than others. Some kids actually thrive in the virtual learning. They feel less self-conscious. But there are other kids who definitely need the person-to-person contact, the immediate feedback, which I think is missing in the virtual learning. So again, I know I sound like a broken record when I keep saying it depends on the student, but yeah, that's what you'd want to assess.
Absolutely. Depends on the student. Let me see. Amanda, do you have any other questions that have come in from other places where we're sending this off?
Just a second.
Okay. While you're looking, I can share a quick anecdote. When you were talking about the testing for ADHD that you do with the tests where kids have to either click on something or inhibit and not click on something. When one of my kids was being assessed, I was describing the test to him and I said, well, the technical term for this is a go, no go test, right? You either do it or you don't, right? And so my kid said, well, Mom, I went.
Oh,
yeah, well,
true.
ADHD. There you go. I went. Amanda, do you have a question there for us?
One just came into you, I think you should see.
Okay. Bear with me for just a moment here. Oh, okay. So this has to relate again with that motivational piece. And I don't think it's necessarily as much on the assessment end. How do you respond to a teacher when you tell the teacher that your child's negative behaviors that they're seeing are because the child is bored? And sometimes the teacher will respond, well, the child needs to learn how to do things they don't like. So how do you balance that out with the whole internal intrinsic motivation piece?
Yeah, I mean, that's tough. And that's why some people excel in college as opposed to grade school, high school, because now they're doing something they actually enjoy. I will tell parents, though, that children do need to learn how to produce work despite something being boring or tedious. It's just what you have to do.
Can you say that one more time so I can record it and play it for my child? Because I had that conversation today.
Yeah, I mean, kids have to, there's just some stuff you have to do despite being bored or something being tedious, just like adults. You know, there are things in our jobs, in our daily lives, in our family lives that we don't want to do because it's boring or it's uninteresting, but we have to do it. So
but there's also a difference, though, when a child is bored because the work is too easy.
Absolutely. And that's where you just want to really hope that the teacher will work with them on, you know, will they give them extra work? Will there be other areas of enrichment? Or you'll have to do that at home.
Got it. Any other questions, Amanda, that have come in from anywhere else? I think I got through everything that was on our chat stream.
I think we're good.
Excellent. Wonderful. Just double checking where I was also taking some notes. No, I think we got them all. So thank you so much. I did find your bio and put it into the chat. Better late than never. But thank you so very much again for joining us this evening. It was really a wonderfully thorough assessment. Ironically, I had a friend from Baltimore who's in the field say, do you know somebody in Virginia who does assessments? And I said, I've got a webinar for you for tonight. So
good.
Perfectly timely. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed talking about it.
We really appreciate it. So thank you to everybody for jumping in and joining us. If you're not a SEPTA member, please join SEPTA. And we are delighted that you were able to come in this evening. So thanks very much. Have a good night and be well.
Take care.
Michelle, you will need to stop the live stream.
Will you talk me through that? Or on here?